Hello and thank you for tuning in to the Niagara Children's Water Festival Alien Invasion activity. As we learn about the significance of water this week, let us also reflect on the land on which we gather, understand the history of the land on which we live that provides us with this precious resource of water. The Niagara region is situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in rich history of the First Nations such as the Hattawanderack, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. The Niagara Children's Water Festival stands with all Indigenous peoples, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live and of the water which sustains us. My name is Carrie Royer, and I work for the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. This is my 16th year presenting at the Niagara Children's Water Festival. Today we're going to learn about alien invaders and how they're impacting the Great Lakes ecosystems. Before we start talking about alien invaders, I want you to think about the water that's around us here in the Niagara region. Earlier today, you may have learned about Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, the Welland River, the Niagara River. As you look at the map here on the screen, you can see that the blue veins that cross our entire peninsula are all the water bodies that surround us. One of the things that can impact the ecosystems and the health of these Great Lakes are alien invaders. When I use the word alien, think of some of the things that might come to mind. You might recognize some of these characters from movies you've seen or your view of aliens from the past. What about where aliens come from? Do you think about space, other planets, other galaxies? Well, there are aliens that live in the Niagara region. Some of them live in ponds and lakes and streams in our backyards. Today we're not going to be talking about science fiction, we're going to be talking about ecology. When it comes to ecology, when we say the word an alien species, what we're referring to is a plant or animal that is living beyond its natural range. This is sometimes due to introductions by humans on purpose, and sometimes it's due to accidental introductions. A native species is a species that evolved in the location in which it lives over thousands and thousands of years and was not introduced to that area by humans. We're going to go through some common invasive species found here in the Niagara region, and today we're focusing on aquatic invasive species because we're at the Water Festival. Phragmites or common reed is a plant that you may be familiar with if you drive anywhere in the Niagara region. You can usually see these growing along roadside ditches, near stormwater ponds, and near lakes and rivers. It's a tall plant that grows taller than me, and it is very aggressive and takes over the areas in which it naturalizes. A rather newly introduced invasive plant is the European water chestnut, which has recently been found in the Welland River ecosystem. Zebra or quagga mussels may be familiar to you if you have spent any time near water in the last 20 years. They've been in the Niagara region for a really long time, and they have often been found attaching themselves to boats and rocks in areas that we're swimming, and you may have had the unfortunate thing of having one of them. They tend to have sharp edges, so sometimes they can cut your hand or your foot if you're swimming near those areas. They can also clog up the pipes that we use to pull water for water treatment for our drinking water. So in the photo you can see where they've really attached on and clogged up those pipes. Mystery snail is a non-native snail that is sold in pet stores as part of an aquarium kit to help clean your tank, but they often get released into the wild and become naturalized. They are not a native species of snail, and they do tend to aggressively sort of reproduce and take over some of those natural ecosystems. This particular species, a red-eared slider, is likely familiar to you if you've ever visited a pet store and seen those cute little turtles that they have for sale. I see them pretty much any pet store I go into. They start out being these really small, cute little turtles, but what most people don't know when they buy them and buy these cute little habitats for them is that these turtles can live 30 to 50 years, and they grow to be bigger than the size of my hand. So they will quickly outgrow the habitat that they are in. And when they are released into the natural environment, sometimes people think that they're freeing their turtle or giving it a better life by releasing it into the natural environment. But unfortunately, this means that these turtles are taking over the habitat of our native turtles, which are eastern painted turtle, and others. So this is just showing you the size of those red-eared sliders when they're in their full-grown size, clearly not fitting into that small little habitat anymore. If you're an angler or you like to fish, you perhaps have accidentally caught a round goby. Round gobies are a not native fish that does invade the natural environment. They tend to be in the shallow waters where you would normally catch sunfish and perch, and they will go after your line just like anything else if you're fishing with a worm. But they are not native, and they do outcompete again for those food and habitat. Goldfish are, again, a cute little pet that is found, and they start off being a really small little goldfish, and they will start to grow and grow. And again, sometimes they reproduce at home, and people release them to the natural environment, and then they continue to reproduce. And once they are in a large environment, they grow to be quite a large size and can be problematic. They tend to make the water really murky and muddy because they're bottom feeders, and they do compete for those habitats and that food. Oh. We're going to watch a video now about sea lampreys. So have
the sea lamprey.
Have you ever seen this unusual creature that I'm holding? Did you know that this toothy mouth is responsible for one of the worst ecological disasters in the Great Lakes? My name is Andrea, and I work for the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. My colleagues Ross, Lauren, Jill, and I will be talking today about the vampire fish of the Great Lakes, the sea lamprey. We'll get this one back in its tank before we tell you more. Sea lampreys are one of the most notorious invasive species in the Great Lakes. Why are they so bad? Sea lampreys are parasites. They are fish that drink the blood and bodily fluids of other fish. And unfortunately, sea lampreys target some of the most valuable fish in the Great Lakes, like lake trout, whitefish, walleye, and salmon. Even big fish like lake sturgeon and small fish like yellow perch are attacked by sea lampreys. The worst part of a sea lamprey is its mouth. A sea lamprey uses its mouth to suction onto the side of a fish, then digs in like a fish hook with 150 teeth and uses its razor-sharp tongue to drill a hole through the side of the fish. Once the hole is made, out comes the blood and bodily fluids that the sea lamprey feeds on. And to keep it flowing, the sea lamprey secretes an enzyme that prevents the fish's blood from clotting, similar to how a leech feeds off its host. The fish is alive while the sea lamprey feasts off its blood and bodily fluids. This is what it looks like when a sea lamprey has attached to a fish. It would be like a parasite the size of a baseball bat attaching to your stomach and drinking your blood. If that happened to you, that would make for a pretty bad day. And to fish in the Great Lakes that are attacked by sea lamprey, it's almost certainly a death sentence. In some circumstances, if 7 fish are attacked by a sea lamprey, only 1 would survive. In other words, 6 out of 7 fish attacked by sea lamprey may die, either directly due to blood loss or indirectly when infection sets into the wound that's left behind from the sea lamprey.
Thanks for watching the video with us. Those sea lamprey are certainly an interesting looking creature. They are a fish, although a lot of people think that they look like an eel. I just want to share that they are not a threat to humans, so don't be afraid to go swimming in the Great Lakes. They attach themselves to cold-blooded animals like fish and are not known to go after humans. And there are folks working on both sides of the border, the Canada-US border, that are working hard to control this species, and they've had almost a 90% success rate in controlling this species. Now that we know what this invasive species are, we're going to look at how they got here. So one of the ways that invasive species can travel long distances is with the help of their human friends and some of the shipping that we do across large distances. So something would probably not normally be able to swim all the way across the Atlantic Ocean if it wasn't for them not being able to attach themselves to a boat. There's a ton of shipping that goes on every single day. The map that's in this that's on the slide shows you the boats that are in the Welland Canal system as of today. This is the active boats that were transporting things on the Welland Canal earlier today through a map. When we back up, we can see in the whole Great Lakes ecosystem, these are all the boats, all the little colorful dots all over this map are the boats that are found in the Great Lakes ecosystem. So traveling from the Atlantic Ocean into Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, as well as Lake Huron, Superior, and Michigan. So lots of opportunities for invasive species to latch onto something and hitch a ride and travel a larger distance than they would be able to naturally. One of the other pathways that they can move from one location to another is through recreation. So things like fishing and boating. Boating can include things like paddleboards, kayaks, canoes, as well as motorboats. And these things can sometimes attach themselves, or the seeds can get caught up in our equipment, and then they can travel from one water body to the next. And as we mentioned earlier, the pet trade, so things like buying goldfish and turtles and releasing them to the natural environment is another pathway that invasive species can move from one area to the next. Why are these things a problem? Why is it a problem to introduce new species into an environment? The problem with invasive species is that most of them are quite aggressive, and that's how they establish themselves in a new environment that they're not familiar with. They often will aggressively go after food and resources and habitat and outcompete some of those native species that are not used to having to fight for the little area that they nest in or the area that they get their food from. They're kind of like the bullies of the ecosystem. What can you do to help? So we all, when we hear about problems like this, we want to know, how can we help this problem? How can we help the environment? So one of the best things that you can do is to never release pets into the natural environment. When you no longer want a pet, or you've had it too long and it got too big and you can't get a new habitat for it, or you're moving and you can't bring it with you, always try to rehome your pet or find a new home. Or sometimes you can bring it back to the pet store that you purchased it from, and they can help you find a new home for it. Before you purchase a pet, make sure you do your research. Don't just walk into a pet store and buy a pet you've never heard of before because it looks cute in the tank. Make sure that you do your research, find out how long they live, how big they get, and what kind of habitat and food they require before you go into purchasing that pet. Those turtles that live 30, 50 years is a really long time to have a pet for. Another thing that you can do is to report any sightings of invasive species. So when you see an invasive species that you're not familiar with, you can use this phone number to report them. And there's also an app that anybody can download that's free to download called the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System that helps us to identify newly introduced species and kind of attack the problem before it gets too far. Earlier today, we talked about the European water chestnut, and this is an excellent example where some local paddlers detected this in the Welland River a few years ago. They reported it through the app, and then that triggered the Invasive Species Center and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters to work collaboratively with the Conservation Authority, and this summer we're hiring 4 students to go into the Welland River and try and remove as much European water chestnut as they can so that it doesn't become a bigger problem. Thank you everyone for listening today. I hope you learned something about aquatic invasive species and some of the ways that you can help. We've provided a take-home activity where you can make a poster of the most unwanted species in your neighborhood. So I encourage everyone to look into what other things might be living in your neighborhood and make a poster to inform your neighbors and the people and folks in your community. And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Great presentation, Carrie. That was awesome information. And it's so cool to see that we can make a difference in our environment. So just along with the European water chestnut, we do have our first question from Mr. Harris's grade 4 class. And they're asking, what should I do if I see an invasive species?
Thanks, Nicole. That's a great question. So we provided the phone number and the app, but obviously with the fact that the Niagara Children's Water Festival is, we're mostly talking to kids, I would encourage that kids talk to their parents if they see something that they think might be aquatic invasive species. Take a picture of it, look it up on the internet, see if you can figure out what it is, and then you can decide if you'd like to report it or call the hotline or figure out what to do next.
Perfect. We'll make sure that we follow those instructions. And so our next question is from Mrs. Fott's grade 3 class, and they're wondering, what are some of the pathways that could introduce invasive species into the environment?
Thanks, Nicole. That's another great question. So we talked about a few like shipping and recreation and fishing. But some of the other pathways are through international travel. So when folks are traveling from one destination to the next, something as simple as seeds getting caught in the mud on the bottom of your shoes can be a pathway for invasive species to be introduced from one area to the next. So really, they have a lot of different ways. Sometimes they can hitchhike on other species and travel greater distances, and oftentimes it's just accidental things like the ships when they pick up their ballast water or scoop up water when they're traveling, and then it gets released in the next port. Most of the time it's accidental.
Perfect. Great information for us, Carrie. And I have another question for you. It's from Mrs. Birch's grade 2-3 class, and they're wondering, can invasive species be animals and plants, or are they just one or the other?
Yeah, so we looked at some examples today, Nicole. There are definitely aquatic invasive species that are plants, like the Phragmites and the European water chestnut. And then there are animals like the Sea Lamprey and the red-eared slider. There are invertebrates, things that don't have a spine, like the mussels and the snails we saw. And some things are teeny tiny, like a water flea that you can't even really see that well with your eyes. So it's a broad range of things, from birds to fish and reptiles and plants, as well as insects.
Perfect. And Mr. Jones's grade 4-5 class is wondering, if your family has a boat, what should you do to protect the spread of invasive species?
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for that question. If you have a boat, a kayak, a canoe, a paddleboard, one of the best ways that you can ensure that you're not spreading invasive species when you're moving from one water body to the next is to clean, dry, and drain your boat. So make sure that in between uses you let it completely dry out and clean out anything that you may have collected along the way. If you're kayaking and you've pulled stuff into your kayak or into your boat, make sure you remove all that before you move on to the next water body.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. And now I have a kind of a tricky question for you. It's from Mrs. White's grade 3 class, and they're wondering, how far can an invasive species travel and spread?
That's an excellent question. I think it depends on what type of invasive species we're talking about. Something like a bird can obviously travel long distances on their own versus something smaller like a snail. But as we noted earlier, with things like shipping and international travel, they can travel huge distances across oceans and continents to get from one place to the next with the help of their human friends.
Perfect. Now I have a couple questions from Mrs. Gainsborough's grade 4 class. And their first question for you is, why do goldfish get so big in the lakes but stay so small in the tanks?
I think that has a lot to do with the habitat that they're in. So they typically won't outgrow the tank or the bowl that they're living in, but once they're released into the wild and they're in a wide open pond or a lake, they just keep growing and growing. They do have a maximum size. Obviously, the pictures that we showed are pretty much the maximum size that they get, but those are some of the reasons why you might not see them get that size at home.
Okay, perfect. And we have another question from Gainsborough School, and it's, how many invasive species are in our region? This is kind of tricky.
Ooh, that is a tricky one. There are, I would say, dozens. If you're looking at beyond aquatic invasive species, if you're looking at all the invasive species, I would say there are dozens at least. Some of the other ones that are pretty commonly known nowadays are things like the emerald ash borer, which has killed off a lot of the native ash trees here, which is a bug. And things like chestnut blade, and there's all kinds of things. So I would say dozens, if not more.
All right, we'll have to be on the lookout for those.
Yeah, anybody that's wanting to learn more, there's the Ontario Invasive Plant Council has a list of local plants that are invasive. And then there's the Invasive Species Center that has lists of all the different types of invasive species. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency also has a long list as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Carrie. We'll have to check that out. So again, we have another question from our grade 4 class, and they're wondering, how long do the sea lampreys live?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it depends, but I would say that they would live anywhere from 3 to probably a maximum of 10 or 15 years, but I'm not actually positive. So good question for them to do some research on.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. And our last question from Gainsborough School, the grade 4 class, they're wondering, how do we know if something is an invasive species?
That usually requires a little bit of research, because sometimes there are alien species that can be introduced to an area and they may not become established and may not become invasive. So invasive is a term that we use only when that alien introduced species becomes aggressive and just takes over a natural area or outcompetes those native wildlife. So I think that the best way to find out if an animal or a plant is invasive is to do your research, again, before you purchase a pet or a plant, even to plant in your backyard. Do the research and find out if that species is invasive, just by looking online or looking in some books to see what you can find. And that's the best way to know. You're not going to be able to know just by looking at it whether it's invasive or not, and just get to know the common invasives in your neighborhood is the best thing I could say.
Awesome. It looks like we all have a little bit of homework today. So we have another question, this time from Mrs. Nash's grade 4 class, and they're wondering, can sea lamprey carry diseases?
That is a good question. I'm not familiar with any diseases that they carry. As far as I know, the negative impact that they have on fish is because they attach themselves and then they create sort of an open wound on the fish that can lead to infection, but I'm not aware of any diseases that are transmitted by the lamprey to the fish. It's mostly that they are quite a large parasite. If you were to compare a fish with a sea lamprey attached, it would be like you having a broomstick attached to you at all times. It's quite large compared to the size of the fish, and so the fish doesn't get enough nutrients because the lamprey is feeding off of their blood, basically, and so that's the impact that they have. I'm not aware of any diseases that are transmitted from the lamprey to the fish.
Great. And this question from Gainsborough School kind of fits right in with that. And they're wondering, how do you get the sea lampreys off the fish?
That's an excellent question. If fish were like humans and had thumbs, they could easily sort of pull them off like a suction cup. Unfortunately, fish don't have thumbs, and that's the reason why the lamprey can sort of attach and stay on there. But when humans pull the fish out of the water, the lampreys will often fall off because they can't breathe outside of the water, just like a fish. Or we can pull them off with just with your thumb. That's an excellent question.
Awesome. Thanks, Carrie. And now we have another question from Mrs. Nash's grade 4 class, and they're wondering, how did the European water chestnut get here?
The European water chestnut likely came here from recreational boating and shipping. The seeds are sort of pokey and they can attach themselves to either clothing or to the boats and parts of the boats and equipment. So it probably got here by traveling on somebody moving from one water body to the next. So that's the main pathway. The problem is that all the Great Lakes are connected. So once it gets into one water body, if it continues to spread, it will spread into all the local water bodies, which is why we want to get to it before it spreads beyond the Welland River at this point.
Cool information, Carrie. And so we have one more question again from Gainsborough School, and they're wondering, how long would a goldfish live in a lake?
Ooh, that's another good question. I would have to think that a goldfish could probably live like 5 to 10 years, depending on what other predators are in the lake with them. And in that time, they would reproduce quite often, and they produce a lot of eggs, so they could easily sort of create a big population in very little time. But I think the lifespan is somewhere between 5 and 10 years, typically.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. That was a great presentation, and thank you for answering all of our questions. And thank you guys for joining us today at the 2022 Niagara Children's Water Festival.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone.